Islam has a variety of enemies: history, science, ethics, common sense, and so on. But Islam's greatest enemy is logic, because logic is what we use to show how history, science, ethics, common sense, and so on refute Islam. Let's look at a simple example using only some information that I used in 3 of my recent videos. In my last video, why Allah couldn't protect ISIS leader Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi from a dog, I quoted Sahih Muslim 5511, one of many hadiths that show how terrified angels are of dogs, even puppies. It was narrated that Aisha said Jibril, that's the Islamic edition of the Angel Gabriel, promised to come to the Messenger of Allah at a certain hour, and that time came, but he did not arrive. He, the messenger, had a stick in his hand, which he threw down and said, Allah does not break his promise, and neither do his messengers. Then he turned and saw a puppy beneath a bed. He said, "Oh, Aisha, when did this dog get in here?" She said, "By Allah, I do not know." He ordered that it be taken out, and Jibril came. The Messenger of Allah said, "You made an appointment with me, and I waited for you, but you did not come." He said, "I was prevented by the dog that was in your house. We do not enter a house in which there is a dog or an image." So, the angel Gabriel promised to meet with Muhammad, and Allah's messengers do not break promises. What was Gabriel's excuse for breaking his promise? There was a puppy in the house, and this puppy prevented the angel Gabriel from keeping his promise. The claim I'd like to draw attention to for purposes of the present video is that Allah's messengers do not break their promises. That's going to be one ingredient in my refutation cocktail. Second ingredient. Last month I posted a video titled "Pakistan Bans Embarrassing Facts About Muhammad." The video was about the nation of Pakistan sending YouTube a legal complaint demanding that YouTube block a video in which I expose yet another embarrassing story about Muhammad. According to the story in question, Muhammad got caught having sex with one of his numerous slave girls in the bed of his wife Hafsa while she was out running some errands. Hafsa found out about it and told Aisha, and Muhammad's wives complained so much that he promised that he would never have sex with that slave girl again. But don't take my word for it. Sunan an-Nasai 3411. It was narrated from Anas that the Messenger of Allah had a female slave with whom he had intercourse, but Aisha and Hafsa would not leave him alone until he said that she was forbidden for him. Then Allah, the Mighty and Sublime, revealed, "O Prophet, why do you forbid for yourself that which Allah has allowed to you?" That's Surah 66, verse 1 of the Quran, until the end of the verse. The relevant Quran passage is Surah 66, verses 1 and 2. "O Prophet, why do you forbid for yourself that which Allah has allowed to you, seeking to please your wives? And Allah is oft forgiving, most merciful. Allah has already ordained for you, O men, the absolution from your oaths. And Allah is your Mawla, Lord or Master or Protector, and He is the All-Knower, the All-Wise." Here's the Muslim commentary, Tafsir Jalalain on Surah 66, verse 1. "O Prophet, why do you prohibit what God has made lawful for you in terms of your Coptic handmaiden Maria, when he lay with her in the house of Hafsa, who had been away, but who, upon returning and finding out, became upset by the fact that this had taken place in her own house and on her own bed, by saying, 'She is unlawful for me,' seeking by making her unlawful for you to please your wives? And God is forgiving, merciful, having forgiven you this prohibition." So, Muhammad swore an oath, promising his wives that he would never have sex with his slave girl, Mary the Copt, again. But Allah said that he could break that promise. Do you see where we're going with this? According to Muhammad, in Sahih Muslim 5511, Allah's messengers never break their promises. According to Sunan an-Nasai 3411 and Surah 66 verses 1 and 2 of the Quran and Tafsir Jalalain, Muhammad broke his promise to his wives. What do we need if we want to draw a conclusion from these two facts? We need logic. The third ingredient in our cocktail is an argument form that I discussed in last month's video, Dave Chappelle Slams Abortion. In that video, I discussed an argument form called modus tollens, the mode of denying. The general pattern is premise 1, if A, then B. Premise 2, not B. Conclusion, therefore, not A. The example I gave was, if X is a cat, then X is a mammal. X is not a mammal. Here we have two separate claims, but if we know these two things, logic allows us to make a third claim. We can conclude via modus tollens that X is not a cat. Premise 1 establishes that all cats are mammals. Premise 2 establishes that X is not a mammal. Since X isn't a mammal, X can't be a cat. Putting all of this together, we can actually make two arguments, one against the Angel Gabriel and one against Muhammad. For our first argument, we have premise 1, if Gabriel is a messenger of Allah, then he won't break his promise. We know this because Muhammad said it. Premise 2, Gabriel did break his promise. Here again, we know this because Muhammad said it. Conclusion, Gabriel is not a messenger of Allah. And we write 1 to modus tollens, which means that if premises 1 and 2 are true, the conclusion is guaranteed to be true thanks to modus tollens. Obviously, Muslims don't want to accept this conclusion, but the conclusion follows necessarily from the premises. So our Muslim friends have basically three options. They can reject the first premise, or they can reject the second premise, or they can reject logic. I'm assuming they don't want to reject logic. What about premise 2? Well, given what the passage says, it's indisputable that Gabriel broke his promise. Gabriel promised that he would meet with Muhammad at a certain time, but he didn't show up. So the only way to reject premise 2 would be to reject the source, but that comes with a cost. This hadith is classed as sahih, or strong, and when our Muslim friends throw out sahih narrations, they're basically telling us that even their most reliable narrations can't be trusted, and that even their most trusted narrators were liars, and that we therefore can't know much of anything about their prophet. Good luck with that. If they don't want to throw the entire history of Muhammad out the window, they'll have to reject premise 1. They'll have to say that a messenger of Allah can break a promise, even though Muhammad said that messengers of Allah don't break their promises. How can they reject premise 1? They're going to have to qualify it. They're going to have to say something like, messengers of Allah don't break their promises unless they have a good reason. And here we would have to ask whether the presence of a puppy is a good reason for an angel to break a promise. Is it, Muslims? If an angel of the Almighty says that he's going to do something, is an adorable little puppy a good reason for the angel not to do what he said he was going to do? Muslims, you need to do something here. Otherwise, we have a pretty straightforward case that the Islamic edition of the Angel Gabriel is not a true messenger of Allah. So you can throw out logic, or you can throw out history, or you can tell us that the Angel Gabriel is a victim of cynophobia, the irrational fear of dogs. Now, for our second argument, this time about Muhammad. This one's even harder to avoid. Premise 1. If Muhammad is a messenger of Allah, then he won't break his promise. We know this because Muhammad said it. Premise 2, Muhammad broke his promise. This is in Sunan an-Nasai and the Quran and Tafsir Jalalain. Conclusion, Muhammad is not a messenger of Allah. Once again, our Muslim friends have three ways around this. Reject logic, reject premise 1, or reject premise 2. The logic, once again, is indisputable. We're using modus tollens. Given what we read In the Quran and Sunan an-Nasai and Tafsir Jalalain, premise 2 is indisputable as well. Muhammad promised his wives that he would stop having sex with his slave girl, then he broke that promise. Side note, he even got her pregnant. She gave birth to a son. Muhammad named him Ibrahim. Ibrahim died when he was around 18 months old. Our Muslim friends can throw the story out, but this is a little more difficult to do here since it's connected to verses of the Quran where Allah is clearly telling Muhammad that it's okay to break his promise to his wives. There is an alternative explanation of the opening verses of Surah 66. There's a story in the Hadith about some of Muhammad's wives complaining about the smell of some honey that he was eating at Zainab's house. So Muhammad swore that he would no longer eat the honey. But Allah revealed Surah 66, verses 1 and 2, showing Muhammad that it was okay to break his oath and to go back to eating the honey. 3 reasons this doesn't help avoid premise 2. First, there's no reason both stories couldn't be true. If Muhammad swore to his wives that he would stop having sex with his slave girl, and he swore to his wives that he would stop eating foul-smelling honey, Surah 66 verses 1 and 2 could be Allah's reply to both incidents. Second, if we could only believe one of these stories, and we had to regard the other as fabricated, which one would we think is the true story? The principle of embarrassment would all but guarantee the authenticity of the story about Mary the Copt. According to the principle of embarrassment, when people are inventing stories about their heroes, they tend to invent positive stories, not embarrassing stories. And when people are inventing a story to cover up another story, they invent a less embarrassing story to cover up the more embarrassing story. So, which scenario makes more sense? 1, Muslims were embarrassed by the story of Muhammad promising that he would stop eating foul-smelling honey, so they invented an alternative story about him getting caught with his slave girl in the bed of his wife Hafsa and promising that he would stop having sex with his slave girl. Or 2, Muslims were embarrassed by the story of Muhammad getting caught with his slave girl in the bed of his wife Hafsa and promising that he would stop having sex with his slave girl, so they invented an alternative story about him promising that he would stop eating foul-smelling honey. We can see why Muslims would invent the story about the honey, but it makes no sense to invent the story about Muhammad getting caught with his slave girl. So there's just no good way to get rid of the story about Muhammad and Mary the Copt. Third, for purposes of my argument, it wouldn't matter which story is true. According to both stories, Muhammad made a promise to his wives, and according to both stories, Muhammad broke that promise because Allah told him to. So either way, Muhammad broke his promise, and premise 2 is 100% true. Hence, if our Muslim friends want to avoid the conclusion that Muhammad is not a messenger of Allah, they're going to have to reject premise 1. They're going to have to say that Muhammad's claim that Allah's messengers don't break promises is false, and they're going to have to correct their prophet by modifying the premise to something like this. If Muhammad is a messenger of Allah, then he won't break his promise unless he has a good reason. But what was Muhammad's good reason for breaking his promise? The reason comes from Allah in Surah 66 verses 1 and 2, where Allah said, Muhammad, I didn't order you to make that promise, so it's okay to break it. What's the principle here? The principle is that if you make a promise, but you weren't ordered by Allah to make that promise, then it's okay to break the promise. It's okay to break any promise that Allah didn't order you to make. So, if you promise to help me paint my house Friday afternoon, and then you don't show up, and I say, yo, what happened? You promised to help me paint my house. According to the Quran, you can reply, well, Allah didn't order me to make that promise, so I don't have to keep that promise. You can make 100 promises and break all of them, as long as Allah didn't order you to make those promises. Of course, the vast majority of promises that people make are not promises that they were ordered by Allah to make. So it's okay to break most promises. Promises are therefore basically meaningless. Notice, even though Muslims don't want to say this, they have to say it, because apart from this qualification, we have an airtight argument proving that Muhammad was a false prophet. So we can turn this over to our Muslim friends and ask them to tell us in the comments section whether it's okay for them to break any promise that Allah doesn't order them to make. If they say yes, then they'll finally be admitting one of the most disturbing facts about Islamic ethics, namely the alarming level of deception that's permissible in Islam. If they say no, then they'll be condemning their own prophet and their own angel and their own God. If it's not morally acceptable to break a promise simply because Allah didn't order you to make the promise, then the Quran is wrong and Muhammad was a deceiver who was inventing revelations in order to justify breaking a promise to his wives. There are lots of other examples like this in the Muslim sources. This is why I said that logic is Islam's greatest enemy. And if logic is your greatest enemy, you are on the wrong side of reality, my friends.